All right, Mr. Parker, are you ready?
I think so.
All right. So you were the head of the Washington's Teachers Union. Can you tell us whose interests you represented when you were the head of the Teachers Union?
Wow.
I'm sorry.
I want to hear this one.
I tell you, that's a good question. Let me first of all start out by saying that I have evolved. Now, and let me explain what I mean when I say evolved. And I think this is a key in terms of understanding teachers unions and how we have to move. That I used to think I put children first. It took me a while to realize that I wasn't putting children first, and technically, I wasn't putting teachers first, and I want to explain that. But in my union box, and I struggled with this when I first became union president, and that was what I felt in my heart and how that conflicted with my role as a union leader. The politically correct statements that I'm supposed to make as a union leader and stay in that box, and what I sometimes felt in my heart was good for kids. And for the first couple of years, I went back and forth between the two. What I really felt was needed to really move kids forward, and the fear I felt in coming outside the union box and maybe making statements and saying things that were not very favorable to my union colleagues. And I can tell you, to say God works in some very mysterious ways. And I'm going to tell you what made it clear to me one day. There was the issue of LIFO. I don't know how many of you have heard of LIFO. That means last in, first out. And the union box is that you don't touch that. All right? That's seniority. You don't touch that as a union leader. Though I had some personal feelings about this when it conflicted with what's best for children, I still was playing both sides of the road. And I'll tell you something that you don't know. It's very interesting. One day I was in Kaya Henderson's office.
Confession, right?
Yeah.
I haven't heard this one
No,
yet.
you haven't heard this one. This is sharp. One day I was in Kaya Henderson's office, and we were talking about this whole thing about seniority. But what had happened, I had called one of my board members prior to that over at Ballou Senior High School. And evidently I had forgotten to disconnect the phone. And so he heard me talking to Kaya about my not supporting seniority. At my next board meeting, the first thing that came up was, I heard you say, and you were talking to the vice chancellor, that you were not in favor of seniority. No, you didn't hear me. I actually lied. No, I'm sorry. You must have missed it. No, seriously. It's like, you must didn't hear this conversation. There's no way that I said I wasn't in favor of seniority, right? Because it was like I didn't want the wrath of my board members at that moment. But I lied. He had actually heard it, and boy, I wish I became, that's when I got rid of my BlackBerry, got an iPhone. But it was a conflict, but let me tell you, say God works in mysterious ways, how I really came to settle on this. I was invited to speak at an elementary school commencement exercise. And a part of that was telling the students, what do I do as a union president? And I said, well, I work on behalf of teachers to make sure that teachers get the kind of resources and supplies and things that they need to give you a quality education. And then I'm also making sure that you have the best possible teachers in front of you. And when I got ready to walk out, this little girl just came up to me out of nowhere and gave me like the warmest hug that I've ever had. It's almost as though she was sending me a message. And so she says, thank you. And I'm saying, so for what? She says, for caring about us and making sure we got the best teachers. And so as I was driving back to the office, it just came real to me. And it was that, you know what? You lied to that little girl. That you aren't really about getting the best teachers in front of her. Because right now you are fighting to make sure that the only criteria for deciding which of her teachers stay and which go is how long they've been teaching. So, and I look at this now that it was a message from God, that this little girl came up there with such an innocence. It's almost like, I'm depending on you to believe. She believed what I said. And I'm depending on you to realize what you said is not true. That day, it became very clear to me that I had to make sure I was going to do the right thing and not what's the politically correct thing. That's the day that LIFO became clear to me. That in order for me to make sure that this young girl has the best teacher in front of her, then I probably had to be the first union president in this country to have the courage to stand up and say, we've got to get rid of seniority. You can't put the best teacher in front of that child, that when a city or a state has to cut teachers, the only requirement is, how long have you been teaching? Because how long you've been teaching does not define how good a teacher you are. So, but I thank God for that little girl, because it made it clear for me. So when you talk about do unions put teachers first, or put the interests of children first, I may be the first in the country to tell you no. We don't. Because many union leaders have the same conflict I had. All right? And that is how to get outside of the union box and do what's right. And so I think it becomes very important, and where I like to get my union colleagues to is to understand we're not only putting children first, we're not putting teachers first. Because, and I go back and give you an example when I talk about the auto workers. Now, my very first car was a Japanese car that I bought. You know why I bought a Japanese car? Because back at that time, their cars were better than most American cars. All right, we had the United Auto Workers where they were getting good salaries, good benefits, but nobody was that concerned about the quality of the product. Now, sooner or later, the United Auto Workers and the manufacturers got together and said, wait a minute, we aren't selling enough of our cars. And the reason is quality. And so then the United Auto Workers began to say, we got to work with management. We just can't be concerned about the benefits and the salaries of our employees. If we're going to be successful, we better start making some good cars. And I look at it as the same thing that our unions have to do now. And that is to say, we can no longer just concern ourselves with what are the benefits our teachers are getting, all right? What are their salaries? We got to look at what is the finished product. Are our children learning? And that as a union leader, and where I'm trying to get my union colleagues to go, is that our teachers aren't successful unless the finished product, all right, is successful. And that's our children. And so when we look at many of the school districts around the country where the product is not successful because our teachers are putting out the product, which is quality education for children. And if that quality isn't there, then as union leaders, we got to back up and say, wait a minute, if I'm fighting for good benefits for my teachers. I'm fighting for this and that. But if it's not in the end showing in the quality, the end result, which is student achievement, we got to reevaluate. But I tell you something else that comes to light to me. I learned in science, I had a great science teacher. I used to memorize this. The law of inertia. You know what the law of inertia is? It says a body or in motion or still will stay in motion or stay still until some outside force what? Changes it. And that's where you come in. That's where all of those who are concerned about education revolution or reform have to come in. As union leaders, we're going to stay the same unless some outside force changes us. We got to have a catalyst. My catalyst was this young girl. I thank God. But you have to look at the union leaders and demand. And I know as Democrats, sometimes we feel like there is no option for us. Since the unions are predominantly Democratic, they must have our interest at heart. Let me tell you, we don't have those children's interest at heart. If children are failing the way they are in schools, something is wrong. What we are doing is wrong. And so, let me go on record, because I didn't pray for me. Pray for me, because I met one of my union colleagues the other night, and I know he wanted to say to me, "You working with Michelle Rhee, have you bumped your head?" And probably wanted to bump my head. But to say to you, no, demand, and expect more. Demand that when you now, those of you who will see the movie will see where the union wrote letters, to parents whenever the group were beginning to take over the schools, right? Now, at our forum the other night, I ran into one of my other union presidents, Jerry Jordan, who's the union president of Philadelphia Teachers Union. And so Jerry and I were on the panel together. So when it was time for Jerry to comment, Jerry says, well, this was fiction. Pretty much what I saw in that movie is not what I see in schools. What the union did in that movie in fighting this change is not what we do. Well, I'm here to tell you, Jerry, I saw a lot of what we do in that movie. I saw a lot of what I did as a union president. Michelle and I had some battles. A lot of it was staying in the union box of like, no, we can't go there. Why can't we go there? Because that's just the way you're supposed to act as a union leader. Doesn't matter whether it makes sense or not. We're supposed to be against anything that is supposed to get rid of seniority or anything else. And getting out of that union box can be tough, but I say to you, keep praying for me. Because as they find out what I said at this conference, I'll get a few calls. Have I lost my mind? But I want to tell you, no, I haven't. I've gained my mind, and that is to do what's right for children.
All right.